Let's continue our discussion of analysis of competitive markets by thinking about a trade quota. So what is a quota? Well, a quota is a situation where the government restricts the quantity of imports into a country. And so literally the quota is the number of units that are allowed to be imported. So our game plan here is to compare a free trade situation with a total prohibition on imports, and then we'll think about a partial prohibition or a quota that's not zero. All right, let's start by comparing free trade to no trade. So with free trade, we have this interesting world supply curve. So the notion here is that this is a product that has a world price, and even this domestic economy is small relative to the world market, and so this domestic economy could buy as much as it wants of this product at this constant world price, PW. Now with free trade, that means that the price is the world price, PW. So that's the price in this domestic market. And let me just be clear, D is the domestic demand curve in the country in question. S is the domestic supply curve, meaning the supply curve arising from local or domestic production, whereas S world is this world price. Anyways, when there's free trade, the price is P world. The quantity traded in this domestic economy is QD. So this demand curve, consumers can go all the way out to this point and choose QD as this quantity of consumption. Now how much of this is imports? Well, at this price, only QS can profitably be produced at home. So QS gets produced at home, but the difference, QD minus QS, is imports. How about consumer surplus? Well, consumer surplus now, since the price is PW and consumption occurs all the way out to QD, the entire triangle between the blue demand curve and the P world is consumer surplus. So it's A plus B plus C plus D. What about producer surplus? And we're talking about domestic sellers. Well, the price that trades, the price that equates supply and demand is this P world. Domestic producers produce out to QS, and they have a price in excess of their marginal costs. So this region E, the sum of all these vertical distances, is the producer surplus for domestic sellers. That's free trade. But now let's think about restricting imports to zero. So this is a zero quota. What happens? Well, what that means is domestic demand has to be satisfied by domestic supply. So that means we now find the equilibrium at this intersection, the intersection of the domestic demand and supply curves. And so now the price rises to P prime, and the quantity traded falls to Q prime. What's consumer surplus now? Well, because this is the quantity people are consuming and this is the price they're paying, only A is available as consumer surplus. What about producer surplus for domestic sellers? Well, now domestic producers are producing all the way out to Q prime. They're receiving a price of P prime, so these vertical distances all the way through here are domestic producer surplus, so that's B plus E. It used to be just E, now it's B plus E. If we kind of do the welfare accounting to ask, well, what's happened to the various parties here? The change in consumer surplus as we restrict or eliminate imports, consumers lose BCD. So the change in consumer surplus is minus B, minus C, minus D. What about the change in domestic producer surplus? Well, domestic producers used to have E, now they have B plus E, so the change in producer surplus is B. And it's pretty clear that the consumers lose more than the domestic sellers gain. Well, why is that? Because look, consumers lost BCD, producers picked up B, so that there's that C and D that just seems to have evaporated. So let's think about that. Here's the change in surplus with the imposition of the restriction or the elimination of imports. And what we see is if we sum up the change in consumer surplus with the change in producer surplus, we're left with minus C minus D. What that means is the deadweight loss here is C and D together. C and D have their own interpretations, and it's worth talking about them. So maybe let's start with D. D is in some sense easier to talk about. So what's D? Well, think about this situation right here. Here's a domestic consumer willing to pay this vertical height, this think where this is on the price axis, this amount for some more of this product. The world price, what it would cost to get it in the world, is down here. So there's room for an exchange that would make them both better off, and yet this does not occur. So this whole triangle in D is a bunch of consumer surplus opportunities that don't occur. Region C is a little bit different. So in region C, think about like this quantity right here. Now, this unit right here is produced at this marginal cost. It could have been produced abroad at this marginal cost. So basically there's extra cost incurred of this vertical distance. If you sum all those vertical distances inside of C, what you have is the extra costs from making it domestically versus in the lower cost place. C and D are both deadweight loss, but they have a little bit different, well, they have rather different interpretations. All right, we've considered free trade. We've considered an extreme quota of 0. Now let's think about an intermediate quota where some amount is allowed in, but not the free trade amount. Right? So consider now a reduction in the existing quota level. Let's allow, that is relative to free trade, let's allow in this amount that we'll call QD1 minus QS1. Well, let's allow that to enter the country. How are we going to find equilibrium? Well, the game plan is this. So the quota tells us how much domestic consumption or domestic demand can exceed domestic supply. So we're looking for the price level such that domestic demand exceeds domestic supply by the amount to be allowed in or imported. All right. So here's the illustration of that. This is the comparison of free trade versus, let's say, some imports, but not a zero. Not no trade and not free trade. So first of all, a review. Free trade was P equals PW, Q equals QD. And in this diagram, consumer surplus with free trade is regions 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, and 7. So it's all this stuff from here to here to here, everything but region 5. Producer surplus with free trade, and again, that's domestic producers, that's region 5. But now we're thinking about the new element, the intermediate quota. So first of all, the imports that are being allowed in are QD1 minus QS1. So it's this distance right here. So how do we find the equilibrium? Well, we look for the price. We look along the price axis until we find a place where the horizontal distance between the blue demand curve and the red supply curve equals the quantity that we're allowing in. When we find that, then we've found the equilibrium. Now, if we only allow this amount in, then the price that allows that to happen is this P quota, right? So over here we could have it as well, PQ, P quota, and the quantity that gets consumed is QD1. So quantity falls from free trade from QD down to QD1, and the price rises from P-world to PQ. The new consumer surplus is just the area under the blue demand curve and above P quota, so it's 1 and 2. The new producer surplus for domestic producers is 5 plus 3, so domestic producers have picked up 3. Now let's talk about winners and losers. Well, consumers have lost 3, 4, 6, and 7, so they've lost this whole trapezoid. Domestic producers have picked up region 3. So this is familiar from an analogous story in the previous picture. But now there's another region. There's this region 4. And what's that? Well, that's going to be a surplus to foreign producers, because the foreign producers really have this. This is what it costs for them to make it. But this is the price they're getting. So for the units that get imported, there's this extra amount per unit that foreign producers are getting. So region 4 is that additional surplus to foreign producers. Now if we do our little accounting exercise and ask where did all the surplus go, we're going to find that from the standpoint of the domestic parties, the domestic consumers and the domestic producers, we've lost, so it's minus 3, minus 4, minus 6, minus 7, plus 3, so we've lost 4, 6, and 7. Now we know what happened to 4. 4 went over to the foreign producers. So that's not a loss, it's a transfer if we care about foreigners. But what about 6 and 7? Well, 6 and 7 are deadweight loss. They're deadweight loss in the same way that we had deadweight loss in the previous diagram. So let me just quickly talk about them. So 7 is these situations where domestic consumers are willing to pay this much. This is how much it would have cost in the world, but these transactions don't occur because of the quota. So all those, summing up across all those are lost opportunities for consumer surplus. That's what 7 is. Whereas 6 is extra cost incurred from producing this domestically. Now why do I say that? Well, in the presence of this quota, QS is how much gets produced by domestic producers. So think about a unit like this unit right here. It could have been produced at this cost, but instead it got produced at this higher cost domestically. Add up all the units like that, and you have all of region 6. So 6 and 7 is deadweight loss. Let me talk a little bit about the relationship between a tariff and quotas. So quotas are rules that say only a certain amount is allowed in. Like in this diagram, we'd say QD minus QS. That's what's allowed in. But one could instead have a tariff. Now what's a tariff? A tariff says bring all you want in, but each unit that comes in, consumers have to pay a tax on it. And so instead of having just a P world, if the taxes or the tariff is T per unit, we now have an effective price for imported units of PW plus T per unit. Now if we set the tariff appropriately, we can actually make this diagram identical to the quota diagram. Only one thing changes, the meaning of region 4. So let me talk this through. With a tariff, let's set a tax that raises the domestic price to a level that targets a level of imports. Right? So how high we choose this tariff determines how high up this curve is relative to P world. If we choose to put this tariff of this vertical distance, then we end up effectively allowing this amount in. Now, the difference between the tariff and quota diagrams is that region 4 now, instead of being surplus for foreign producers, it becomes tax revenue or tariff revenue to the domestic government. Otherwise, the analysis in this diagram looks the same as the analysis in the quota diagram. Now, this does raise an interesting question. Why would you use a quota if you can accomplish all the same things, except that in the case of the tariff, region 4 is revenue to the domestic country's government, whereas in the case of the quota, region 4 is a bonus for foreign producers? Why would you use a quota? I mean, the answer is that sometimes you want to throw foreign producers a bone, meaning, although it's in some sense harmful to them to not allow their products in, if you do it as a quota, although they get to send less quantity to you, they get a higher price per unit. And if you think back in the U.S. to the early 80s, when Ronald Reagan was president, the United States imposed a so-called voluntary export restriction on the Japanese that said that the Japanese could only send 1.68 million vehicles to the U.S. per year. It wasn't done as a tariff, it was done as a quota. And what happened at that time was the price of Japanese cars went up, so although Honda and Toyota were sending fewer cars here, they got higher prices per car, and so it wasn't quite as punishing as it might otherwise have been. All right, how do you work a problem of this sort? Well, here's what you need. So you need market demand, and here's a market demand curve, P equals 100 minus Q. Here's a domestic supply curve, and then here's a world price, just a constant world price. And let's compare free trade with a quota of 30 units. So how would we go about doing this? Well, first we can calculate the free trade equilibrium. So how does that work? Well, we have the domestic demand curve, D, and we have the world price of 30. We look for this intersection. Where does the intersection of P equals 100 minus Q occur with 30? Well, that means 30 equals 100 minus Q, so Q equals 70, and sure enough, there's 70. When the world price is 30, there is some domestic production. Now, how do we know that? Well, let's think back to what the domestic supply curve is, and I'll just pop back to that slide for a second. 20 plus Q. So what we're saying is, find the Q such that 30 equals 20 plus Q, and that Q is 10. There's that 10 right there. So domestic production is 10. Imports are the difference, the 70 minus 10, or 60. Now let's think about an import quota of 30 units. So how do we do this? Well, the idea is we're looking for a price such that domestic demand exceeds domestic supply by 30. So we're looking for a place where the difference between the demand curve and the supply curve is 30. So how do we do that? Well, we can write an expression for demand, P equals 100 minus QD. Notice that we put a subscript, D, on the quantity, and we can write a supply curve, P equals 20 plus Q, and let's subscript that, because what we're looking for is the price such that the quantity on the demand curve exceeds the quantity on the supply curve by 30. So if we write down this equation and then substitute in for QD and QS, we have the following. 100 minus P, which is the quantity on the demand curve, minus P minus 20. And that should be minus P plus 20 equals 30. And if you solve that through, and here it is correct, it's 120 minus 2P equals 30, or P equals 45. So here's P equals 45. And now we can find the various other relevant points in the diagram. At P equals 45, what's consumption? Well, use the demand curve, P equals 45, so Q equals 55 equals 100 minus 45. So let's say that in English for a second. We've got P equals 100 minus Q. That's the demand curve. We have a P equals 45, and so that means 100 minus 55 is Q, and there's 55. Boom. Domestic production, what's that? Well, it's 25. Now, how do we know that? Well, we can plug into the supply curve. What was the supply curve? It was P equals 20 plus Q. P is equal to, as we said, 45. So that equals 20 plus 25. And so there's that 25. What's imports? Well, imports are the difference between consumption, 50, and domestic production, 25. So 55 minus 25 is 30. Let's talk about an actual case. Let's talk about sugar. So it turns out that sugar is grown cheaply near the equator. This is a world map showing sugarcane output, and the sugarcane intensive regions are darker green, and you can see they tend to be near the equator. It's just because that's where sugarcane tends to grow efficiently. Now the U.S., turns out, restricts imports, and it literally takes the form of a list that gets announced each year. You know, here are the countries that get to send sugar to the U.S. in exchange for money, and here's the amount they get to send. You know, if you can see this, the font is kind of small, but it's a list of countries and some numbers showing the amount. Basically, it says raw cane sugar allocations. So some lucky countries get to send the U.S. some sugar. So one country that doesn't get to send is Cuba, for historical reasons. All right, so let's think about the impact of this sugar quota. So this diagram shows you the domestic. Let's think about the impact of this sugar quota on the U.S. in 2005. So here's the domestic demand for sugar. Here's the domestic supply of sugar. And by the way, it is possible to make sugar in the U.S. There's a little bit of cane sugar production, but a whole lot of beet sugar production. Beet sugar production tends to be more expensive than cane sugar production, but again, because we restrict imports, it maintains demand even for this higher cost domestic stuff. So let's see how it affects the market. Well, the world price is about 12 cents a pound, at least it was in 2005. But given that the quota only allows a certain amount in, so it allows this amount here in, we end up satisfying a lot of domestic demand with domestic supply. Now the effect of this is to increase the price from 12 cents to 27 cents, reduces the quantity consumed a little bit from 23 to 20, But the effect of this is a reduction in consumer surplus of regions A and B and C and D. It's $3.3 billion per year. Now, some of that ends up as a gain to domestic producers, because domestic producers now get this price here and produce all the way out to here, and so this region A is an additional producer surplus for U.S. producers. There's some benefit to foreign producers. The lucky folks who make it onto that list that the U.S. Trade Representative put together, they get this price of 27 cents and it only costs them 12 cents, so region D is a gain to foreign producers. It's $0.8 billion. But there's deadweight loss, B and C, on the order of $1.2 billion per year. Okay, what do we take away from all this? Well, remember, bigger picture, we were thinking about the perfectly competitive model, and then we're putting in various kind of interferences in markets, and here we were thinking about import quotas and a little bit about tariffs. So let's just talk about what we did. So what do? Quotas limit imports, and what they do is they raise prices then above the world level, and they reduce the quantity consumed domestically. Quotas help domestic sellers and some foreign sellers, but they hurt domestic consumers, and they hurt the other foreign sellers who aren't allowed to sell here. Okay? But, kind of big punchline, they hurt domestic consumers and they help domestic sellers. They have this side benefit of helping the lucky foreign producers who get to send stuff here, but they also shut out a whole bunch of other foreign producers. Finally, tariffs have similar effects, except that the domestic treasury in the importing country, the country that imposes the tariff, the domestic treasury, rather than lucky foreign sellers, get the benefit.